We've had a prime minister resign. We've had a Ontario election campaign and a Liberal leadership race, all in the span of essentially 6 weeks.
In the case of Freeland's resignation, the country totally forgot about the $62 billion deficit that she left us in the fall statement. And I also see the element of using media as a propaganda machine. That's what dictators do. Lydia Miljan is a well-respected political science professor at the University of Windsor. She is known for her sharp insights and unconventional takes on today's big issues. Last time on this podcast, we tackled issues related to media bias, DEI, and government overreach. This time around, she's back with an unfiltered take on Canada's new Prime Minister, the US-Canada trade wars, Trudeau's legacy, and what's next for Canada's economy and culture. This is the episode you don't want to miss on this podcast. Yes, so I'm doing well. Life is good. How are you two?
Good. Been busy right now, yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine it's a very busy time of the year,
Yeah.
especially for you.
And then politics makes it even busier.
How do you like the politics side of this whole matter?
I mean, I think like everyone, I'm frustrated with the uncertainty. There's just too many things that we don't know. And so it's making everybody a little bit off balance.
Right. Well, it's just the nature of politics, right? I think leadership in itself, which I've taken a lot of time to study, in itself is great. But when we add the mix of politics and people's ego and wanting to cling onto power, their narcissistic behaviors, and all of our evil doings generally, once we add it to the mix, then politics is nasty.
Yes, it is.
The last time we had a conversation, interestingly, it was December 20th. I looked up the date. It's just shy of 3 months right now, but it looks to me like it's about 3 years with a series of events that we've seen since that time. Is it the same way it feels to you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, a lot has happened. We've had a prime minister resign. We've had a Ontario election campaign and a Liberal leadership race, all in the span of essentially 6 weeks. So it has been a quite remarkable time.
Let me actually just go through some of the events that we've seen just to refresh our memory. You talked about just a few of them just now, but let's hear this ones. Before then was when Chrystia Freeland tendered a resignation, the letter which was actually quite telling on the government. And December 23rd was when we had the Atlantic Caucus letter, also they asked for Trudeau to resign. And then January 6th was when Trudeau actually asked to prorogue Parliament, sending a note to the GG. And before then, throughout the holiday, it was actually silent. And then we had a Liberal race, which was the four candidates, Carney, Gould, Baylis, and Freeland that we saw on the race. And then we saw Carney just won the 9th of March, which is just 2 days ago. How do you appraise this series of events generally? What do you think it bids for Canada as a whole?
Yeah, it was a very truncated leadership race, and I think it was fraught with a lot of concerns about the potential of foreign interference. And so you had this tension with the Liberals where on the one hand, they wanted to increase obviously their membership so they can get more votes. And the other hand, they wanted to make sure that the people signing out were actual Liberals. So, when you look at that part of it, as much as Carney can boast, he got 86% of the vote, you get 86% of a 38% turnout, right? So they had 400,000 members, but only 38% of them either could or chose to vote in that election. So, you have a new leader with a very small mandate, given that only Liberals were able to vote. The Liberals were running this campaign where we really didn't hear much about the other candidates. We just heard about whether or not Mark Carney could beat Pierre Poilievre. And so there wasn't a lot of critical evaluation of Carney's policy. So I'll talk a little bit about the other candidates. The other candidates really couldn't get into the news cycle. We didn't know much about them. And in fact, there were actually a couple candidates who didn't make it on the final ballot because the party decided for various reasons to kick them off. So you ended up with this situation with four people. And when you saw the debates, there were four people who basically agreed with each other. There was very little differences between them. And so I think Canadians really don't have a good sense of the new prime minister.
So why do you think that happened? Why do you think they were having that debate in court in an echo chamber of ideas?
Well, I think in part because they just didn't have time. And also, it's just the nature of having a campaign like this where you're not actually trying to get new members. Like the deadline to become a member of the Liberal Party was like 1 or 2 weeks into the campaign. So most of the work it was just trying to shore up support of the people there. And if you contrast that to, say, the conservative race that happened a few years back, there it was all about how do you get new members? And more importantly, how do you get people who will pay to become members of the party? So the Liberal Party membership didn't rely on new members. And so it really ended up being, how do we just get the people who are already at the table to vote for one of us? And that was the main focus of the campaign. And it seems to me that Mark Carney's strategy in particular was, don't answer any questions, don't be too available, because it seems that Canadians, at least in the polling, were willing to project onto him what they wanted him. He's got a lot of credentials. Sounds like a smart guy. And so he didn't do a lot of major interviews. He did, like, I think, one interview with the national media, and that was Rosemary Barton on CBC. He completely he didn't take any questions from media in his last week of campaigning. So he was really campaigning in a very safe manner. And obviously that worked for him because he was able to get the majority of people who voted in the leadership race to vote for him.
Right. So let's talk about Mark Carney here. I have a lot of concerns about the way he won this Liberal race, and it's not because I don't support him as a person, but I think it belittles the democratic process in the way I appraise it. One, the media did disservice to Canadian, and the second is also that they tend to all be friends. I know Wikipedia says that Carney and Freeland have been friends since a very long time. Should that be priority over the leadership of 44 million people in the case of Carney, for instance?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to criticize the media. I think if it's true that the media was sort of nudging and hoping that it was going to be a Carney victory, well, they got that. The problem with that approach, with sort of having a coronation, is he hasn't been tested. He hasn't been properly tested, and he's not prepared to run a general election campaign. If he calls an election within the next couple weeks, which is highly likely, he's doing it based on the hope that the rest of Canada will basically take the same approach as the Liberals and not delve too carefully into his past or even to what his policies are. The problem with that approach is that he's not going to be competing amongst friends as he was with the Liberal Party. He's going to be competing amongst people that he has called out as being just like Trump or being a danger to Canada. So the gloves are off. And for him to be able to withstand the daily barrage of attacks, not just by the opposition parties, and it won't be just Pierre Poilievre, it'll also be the other opposition parties. And he'll also have to face the media. I think Canadians will demand that the media ask him some tough questions, such as, if you plan, as you said, to get rid of the carbon tax, what is your replacement for it? Because he said that there was going to be a replacement for it. He also said he was going to repeal the increase of the capital gains tax. Again, the question would be, well, the previous government that you advise, let's remember he advised them, went ahead with that. So I would ask him, if I were a journalist, did you give them that advice? What was your role in that capital gain? And why would the government want to do that? Well, they'd wanted to do that because they needed to raise some capital because they had a deficit crisis that's ballooning out of control. So then the next follow-up question would be, if you're not going to increase taxes, how are you going to pay for the existing operational budget that you claim is going to be balanced in 3 years, plus pay for these so-called new investments? I mean, those are some pretty fundamental questions that he can't really wiggle out of if he is going to run this as his platform in a general election campaign.
Right. So do you think Carney as a person stands a chance to renew the face of the Liberal Party right now in Canada? Because I think the party has been defaced by Trudeau since the last 10 years. Do you think he can really renew the face of the Liberal Party?
Well, it seems that he's their best hope. I mean, certainly, national public opinion polls suggest that he has a good chance at it. However, history tells a different story. I mean, we often get really excited by a new leader when they have this leadership race, but oftentimes the support that they get from that convention bounce tends to be dissipated by the time you get to election day. Even though elections are really short, only about 4 weeks, a lot happens in a campaign. So whatever benefit he had from the winning the leadership race is going to be pretty much gone. And again, he's running. We know this is a change election. So he's running on this idea that he is the agent of change. But yet everything he's done, and it's only been a day or two, suggests again to me that it's going to be more of the same. Look at who he's choosing to help run his office. He chose a former Trudeau cabinet minister, a cabinet minister that Justin Trudeau kicked out of his cabinet, Marco Mendicino, as his chief of staff. He's also chosen David Lametti, another Trudeau cabinet minister that got passed over for someone else to help with that transition. Then you look at all the current cabinet ministers who endorsed him, so people like Stephen Guilbeault, who was all in on the carbon tax, is now saying, yes, I want you there. So I think that, if he really wants to show and demonstrate that he's an agent of change, it means his cabinet can't be the same people that were the cabinet under Justin Trudeau. They've got to be new people. Otherwise, what's different except that we've changed a guy with brown hair to a guy with gray hair and more credentials. But that's about the extent of the differences so far.
Right. So let's talk about his record as well, because one of the things they've touted in this liberal leadership race is his experience as a banker and who was led two major banks in the world. I don't know if you're familiar with his record in those two major offices that he held. How do you appraise that?
Well, for one, it's not a banker in the traditional sense of running a private bank, right? He was a bureaucrat. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada. And so, what does that role do? It sets monetary policy. It actually doesn't set monetary policy. It acts on the basis of the policy that's been provided to them by the government of the day. So in his case, he was appointed by Stephen Harper, and they're using that a lot to their credit to say, hey, a conservative prime minister appointed you, and he said you did a great job. Clearly, he did. I mean, clearly, the government of the day did a great job because we were dealing with the financial crisis of 2008. But Stephen Harper pointed out, Mr. Carney is taking a lot of credit for things that he didn't have a direct hand in. All the heavy lifting was actually done by the finance manager, Jim Flaherty. He just was the bureaucratic arm that followed through on those decisions. So let's give him success for the 2008 crisis. Then he gets to be the governor of the Bank of England. And that is not such a great record. My understanding of it is that he also had to deal with the COVID. They also had to deal with inflation. And, Liz Truss, who was the very short lived prime minister in England, has nothing good to say about Mark Carney. She says he was not very helpful with them to help them manage the economy. And in fact, he left the post early. He didn't fulfill his time. So that's his sort of banker experience. Now, he's also worked at private equity firms, and it seems to be that his big focus has been, since leaving those two positions, has really been on the international front, looking at how to have a green transition, all in on climate action and things like that. But that is a lot of those positions, and it's hard to get a sense of what he actually did. He says he negotiated things, doesn't tell us specifically what he negotiated, but he claims that he was, involved in all these organizations, and that's the extent of it. But, a lot of those organizations want to transition to green economies, want to go to net zero, and some of his own investments. It's been alleged that while he was saying no to pipelines in Canada, he was saying yes to pipelines in other areas. And in fact, his investments were investing in coal activity rather than in Canadian clean energy. So there's some really concerning questions about his track record that he hasn't answered, and I think are great liability to him and the Liberal brand, especially as they profess to be so committed to climate change action.
Right. Yeah. And I think the other thing is we hardly know anything about his philosophy because he's not been a politician before, apart from being at the top of two major national banks. We don't know much about his political philosophy. Like he's mentioned, woke is good. We're not going to be like the United States, who is banning woke cultures now. But do you know anything about that with respect to Carney, especially about social policies?
We know nothing about him with respect to social policies. I mean, he has a book. I read a book review, which isn't really the same as reading the book. It's called Values. Again, his main focus is on climate change. It's on how to change economic systems to deal with a green transition. I guess I get frustrated with his rhetoric because on the one hand, he says he's not going to do slogans because that's his criticism of Pierre Poilievre. It's like, okay, fair enough. You don't like his axe the tax. But then he goes ahead and says, I'm going to do what they've been promising to do all this time. But he also just started with a slogan. He essentially said the central part of his campaign was that they were going to spend less but invest more. And essentially, he wanted to divide up the budget to an operational budget and this investment budget. And then he talked about things like catalyzing investment. So it sounds like really important and fancy, but when you think about it, it's like, well, you actually only have one budget. You're spending less. If you say you're going to spend less on your operational budget, it means you're going to cut something, right? Like if I say I'm going to spend less on my household budget, it means if, akin to Chrystia Freeland, I got to cut my Disney Plus subscription, right? That's where I spend money, or I'm not going to eat as much food, or I'm going to get rid of my car. That's what you spend less on. Investing means you're putting into savings, essentially what investment means. But that's not how he's talking about it. He's saying he's going to invest in special projects that somehow catalyze the economy. But I don't know what that means because he didn't really explain it. He just used his baffle-gab piece of economic work. And presumably we're supposed to just take him at face value. But he doesn't say what those projects are. Maybe it's a pipeline. Maybe it's high-speed rail. We don't know because he was in favor of it during the debate. He said, yeah, when they asked them, what do you guys think about all these new pronouncements that Trudeau was giving? They were like, yeah, we like all of them. So again, nothing screens change, like doing exactly the same thing as the last guy.
I think that's a very important point. I think the other very important point, which I talked about in a recent monologue on the podcast as well, is the deflection that we are seeing right from the primaries even until now. The deflection talking about Trump. I think Trump is an additional problem for Canada, but it's not. I don't think Trump is the fundamental problem that Canada is dealing with. We had a series of problems since 2015, right before Trump took office on January 20th of this year. Would you agree that this is a deflection?
Oh, Trump is a brilliant strategy for any politician to be the foil against. Rather than fighting against your opponent, just say Trump. Just say your opponent is just like Trump. It's sort of guilt by association. It certainly worked well for
Bernie?
Ford, right? So Premier Ford, you or that is the pretext to have his snap election campaign. And the opposition parties couldn't get any traction because, Ford's, going off to Washington during the campaign to say, I'm fighting for, your jobs and I'm going to be the tough guy. So, a politician who can say, I'm going to stand up to Ford and is believable obviously seems to be a winning strategy. The question remains, when will this election happen? Will Trump still be the ballot box issue? So we're in this bizarre situation where every month Trump keeps like putting another deadline in, a new tariff. And Premier Ford actually just recently said, we're going to charge Americans an extra 25% on their electricity, only to back off on it again himself. Today, Ford has said he's not going to do that. So, if this gets resolved over the next 3-4 weeks, now let's say Trump says, okay, the Canadians did what they had to do. They're tougher negotiators. I'm going to back off from Canada. It's no longer a campaign issue. Even if your election is at the end of April, it kind of takes the wind out of that sail, and then you've got to do something else. Now, if Trump is still the issue, then it's a matter of who's going to show that they are the strongest to stand up to Ford. The problem is there's no difference in policy with respect to standing up to Ford. Everyone seems to be saying we're going to fight them dollar for dollar tariffs. Okay, so how do I know who to vote for based on that? The conservatives say that and the liberals say that. The NDP say that. That's not a really good ballot box question, except to say who makes me afraid that they're going to cave. And I don't know what the answer is to that. And I think that's just a gut reaction that people are going to have.
Right. And I think, it minimizes the problems that they've created in the first place. And the reason why we're having this election. We're not having this election in the first place because Trump got into power. We're having this election because the current prime minister, or the departed one, Justin Trudeau, he failed at his job. The MPs called him out. He lost confidence in the public. He had only, I believe, 22% public approval by December of last year. And that's the reason we're doing this election. We're not doing it because, Trump won an election late last year and it was sworn in this year. And it sounds to me like what we saw also in December. We were talking about in the last time we discussed this with Freeland. In the case of Freeland's resignation, the country totally forgot about the $62 billion deficit that she left us in the fall statement. Till now, I don't know. I might have missed the news, but I don't know if that conversation ever ever happened. I don't think media queried her about it. Neither is anybody talking right now about how did we even get to this point where we're calling the election and this is not about Trump. I think there's a lot of people, stakeholders to blame for this. I don't know what you think about that.
No, you're absolutely right. We've completely lost sight of our own economic picture, in part because we haven't had Parliament sitting since the Prime Minister said he was going to resign. Actually, at the time of this recording, he still actually hasn't technically resigned. He has to actually have to go to the Governor General and formally resign before Mark Carney can become Prime Minister. But leaving that aside, yeah, you're absolutely correct. We have not had any real serious economic discussion apart from tariffs. We don't really know the state of our finances. And let's recall that because Parliament is prorogued until the end of this month, there is no new spending that government can do. And in fact, they have to return or go into an election right away simply because they've run out of money, right? So there's certain things that the government can spend, and that you do that for your budget year. Your budget year ends, I think, March 28th. So unless there's a new budget between now and March 28th, the government's going to go to a standstill. So that actually tells me that Carney's going to have to force an election or face a vote of non-confidence simply because they've got to keep the lights on. Now, if there is an election called, the rules change a bit and you can have some emergency powers during the election campaign to sort of keep government workers still on the job. But they've got to figure that out really quickly. And so I think it would be important for if Carney's serious about running the government to actually show us the books and show us what his economic plan is.
Right. And even talking about Trump here for just for a second more here, I think with respect to the tariff, in my own estimation, and I'll put a question to you. In my own estimation, the reason why Trump even sees an opportunity to discuss this issue about tariff and he's trolling the whole nation of late is because we brought ourselves to a point of economic vulnerability. I think he saw that, and that's why he's punching us really hard there. I don't know if you would agree with that. And if that be the case, is it really about dollar for dollar tariff or about we going back to the drawing board and try to solve our economic problems that we've created for ourselves that put us at this point of disadvantage in negotiation? Or is it this dollar for dollar tariff that we're going to be talking
Yeah,
about?
well, I mean, our response to Trump is it's sort of all over the place, and that's sort of how we respond to him. Why he chose to do this, I don't think he actually thinks that much about Canada, quite frankly. This was a way for him to make the case to the American people that I'm going to change the way in which I tax people. So his whole campaign promise was to actually have income tax reductions and get rid of income tax reductions. Well, the government still has to collect money. So essentially what he's done is moved away from an income-based tax system to consumption-based tax system. And so, him putting on a tariff on Canadian or Mexican or whatever country's goods, he's not actually taxing us. He's taxing his own people. But ironically, or not ironically, maybe he knows this, what happens when you pose this tariff on countries is that their dollar weakens. So he's actually boosted the American dollar while weakening the Canadian dollar. So even with that 25% tariff, our goods are still somewhat attractive to an American buyer, right? Because we're getting discounted dollars. And so he's taxing his own, so he's basically still raising money through a consumption tax. So what it's going to, the expectation is that American firms and American consumers are going to say, well, even though I still get a discounted rate from Canada, maybe we should move our operations to the States. Maybe we should buy American, and that way we don't have to pay that. And we get that income tax break. And simultaneously, when Canadians say we're going to do dollar for dollar tariffs, well, they're just taxing you and me. They're just imposing another higher cost on us. So we get a double whammy because now our dollar is weaker and we have to pay a higher consumption tax on goods coming from the United States. So obviously, Donald Trump knows that that is something that weakens our vulnerable markets. He doesn't care, obviously. He does want to renegotiate the free trade agreement. Now, let's remember, all of this is illegal under the current free trade agreement that he negotiated and signed. But apparently, it takes so long to go through trade disputes that he's allowed to get away with this. So ultimately, Canadians have to decide, are we going to continue to do business in the United States? Should we just wait it out for the next 2 years? It is really difficult for Chrysler. I'm like in Windsor, right? So Chrysler and Ford, they're not going to be able just to pull up their factories and move someplace else. Factories take long time to build and get going. So, it's not something they can do right away, and people might want to wait that out. But, as much as everyone despises Trump, I think we owe him a bit of gratitude because he's forced us to look at our own knitting and figure out what are we doing wrong in this country? Why is it that there are greater interprovincial trade barriers within Canada than we have with the United States? Why is it that we don't let people trade freely across the provinces? And so that's now the new consensus that maybe we can actually withstand anything that the Americans do just by trading amongst ourselves. This is a huge country with lots of competitive advantage. And the more we buy from BC or Saskatchewan or Ontario or Nova Scotia and vice versa, the less we're reliant on the American market. And so that has forced all Canadians, especially our leaders, to say, okay, let's dismantle this problem that we've had since 1867. So there you have it.
I know this sounds weird to say because the liberals have been using this in their campaign videos. They say, let's get rid of this artificial drawn line. That was because Trump said that. What do you think about that? The artificially drawn line. Should
And
we really get rid of it and have a free trade environment?
well, we've that's what the free tr that's what NAFTA was supposed to be all about. The original free trade agreement was to get rid of those trade barriers. And we gotta recall in the 1980s, we did have lots of, tariffs and trade barriers between the 2 countries. And, the free trade agreement and the NAFTA after it were hugely successful. It was very disruptive. There were manufacturing jobs that were lost in places like Canada, the United States, to the benefit of Mexico. But overall, all of our economies improved. All 3 of the economies improved, and we really had some great synergies. Again, living in Windsor, the trucks are going across that border every minute of every day. That is the busiest border crossing in North America. So when you think about it, like a car, if you buy a North American car, it is not built in any one country. Component parts are built here in Canada. They cross the United States. They do something in the state. That same car travels the border several times before it's finally finished. So to say, so we already had that. That artificial line is a cultural line as much as it's a political line. And I honestly don't think Donald Trump has thought very much about what the consequences would be of annexing Canada. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous idea. When he makes that statement, he doesn't understand our culture. He doesn't understand our norms. And I'd say, you want to tackle Quebec? Well, good luck to you because that is its own nightmare. So, he better be careful what he wishes for because maybe some Canadians would like, okay, you can have that very thorny issue. So yes, it's an artificial line, but it's a line that's important. It's important to Canadians, and I think it's also important to Americans.
Right, right. I think that's a very funny way to even put that. Like we have a lot of intrinsic and unique problems that will be really hard to make us an extra state. So let's begin to walk away home from here. I sent a thought to you, and it's because when I look at this kind of issues that we're talking about, economic and trade wars and economic vulnerability that we found ourselves as a nation, and when I think about the cultural or sociocultural wars that we've created for ourselves internally in Canada over the last decade as well, and the way power dynamics played out in the last days of Trudeau, when I also think about some of those political gimmicks, in the words of Freeland, trying to, in quote, buy votes. A lot of people have said that to be true, and I believe that to be true. And if I compare it to my experience growing up in the 90s under dictatorship government, there's a lot of attributes there that actually align. I know it's not quite a dictatorship government that we're running here. This is a very democratic government. But I think slowly it looks to me like we're weakening the elements that would sustain a democratic government. Would you agree with that thought process?
Well, I mean, certainly in the short term, that certainly feels to be the case. We have a prime minister who, rather than facing parliament, rather than going to the electorate, chose, basically prorogues parliament, resigns, and we have to wait till the liberals sort themselves out. And then they, in basically a private contest, select someone. So certainly that feels like the case now. But at the same time, we do have norms and convention. This is how, prime minister, there is no job of the prime minister that enumerated in the Constitution, right? The prime minister is the leader of the party that has the confidence of the House. And so the next steps in terms of legitimacy are for that party to get the confidence of the House. And they can do it one or two ways. They can go back to Parliament, put forward a speech from the throne, and have a confidence vote. If they win, they're in, right? that the confidence of the House. If they lose, that does trigger an election. Or failing that, or even before that, if Mr. Carney says, I don't want to start my career with a vote of non-confidence, and he decides to say we're going to go straight to the polls, well, then we have an election very quickly. Like we could have a new government before May. And that's how quickly this thing can happen. So in that respect, I think we're still we're still on the side of the angels when it comes to democracy. We don't have a functioning parliament, but we still certainly have parliamentarians, and that they're still able to speak. So in a dictatorship, what would be different is that as little as we've heard from Pierre Poilievre in the news cycle, we would have gotten nothing. Like, he would have been jailed by now, for example, in a dictatorship. And so the fact that he still has a platform, he's still able to speak to Canadians, and there's obviously still resonating. The polls don't really necessarily demonstrate this, but I think it was an interesting fact that CBC put out that Pierre Poilievre, on the day of the Liberal convention, had a rally in London where he had over 2,500 people in attendance. That was more than what the Liberals had at their National Party convention. So that tells you a lot about the motivation and the enthusiasm that opposition parties in this country still enjoy.
I think I see your point, but one of the most common phrases in our time is that oppositions attacked threats to democracy. It's not unusual that we heard that from the States, for instance, and we hear that about someone like from Trudeau or even Carney now, about Pierre Poilievre, calling him not necessarily a threat to democracy, but it's a threat to the Canadian culture and values. That's part of what they've talked about. Do you think those kind of fear tactic, fear mongering approach to opposition is actually a reasonable way to sustain a democratic system? And I say this because, again, I grew up under dictatorship and I see this kind of element. And I also see the element of using media as a propaganda machine. That's what dictators do. And we have to be careful about that. And, I saw these things in the 90s and I'm seeing things leaning towards that. That's my greatest fear here. And that's why I thought I'm going to ask you that question. How do you feel about the issue of threat to democracy that we hear, fear mongering
Yeah,
tactics?
I mean, I think both sides do it. I mean, I guess I don't get too fussed about it just because I think negativity is a good part of politics. You try to paint, the other guy as not being noble or honorable, and you paint yourself with a different brush. I think Canadians can see through that. They can see through the name calling. Both sides are calling the other side a threat. The Conservatives are saying that Carney is a sellout and that he's not in it for Canadians. The Carney team says that Poilievre is also a sellout to America, because they say it in different ways. That is what the nature of politics has always been in all sorts of different democracies. And, sometimes we believe them and sometimes we don't, but that's part of the overall rhetoric. As for the media, I think that, again, we've been in a bubble where there has been disproportionate amount of attention paid towards the Liberals and not to the other parties. Like, when last time you've heard about the NDP, for example, right? They've been completely wiped out of the news cycle, and their poll numbers show that. Like, they're down to 11%, which is an all-time low. So I don't believe that number either. I think that is an exceptionally low number for the NDP, and so it's unlikely that those things are real. I think what the pollsters are measuring is just, are people open to the idea of Carney and the Liberals again? And I think that some are saying that they are. But again, that's in the absence of other people attacking the party on a day-to-day basis, on a fair basis in the news cycle. So we'll really have to see how the coverage of an actual campaign works out, and, whether or not if they're only talking about Carney in a general election, then we've got problems. Then clearly I would agree with you. But, if we go back to the similar norms about fair and equal coverage of major political parties, that kind of advantage will dissipate.
Right. So let me give you one last question here as we wrap up. And it's a two-in-one question. Give an advice to Canada here. Because gradually we see that these videos, these conversations are gaining attention, over 40,000 views the last time. So there's a lot of people who want to hear what you have to say. And I must say, Dr. Miljan, people actually respect your opinion publicly. Shame on CBC that does not allow comments, but I read comments and I hear what people say about you. There's a lot of respect for your work. And I have a lot of respect for your work as well and for you. That's why I keep coming back for us to have this conversation. So what's the advice to Canadians? And the second part of this is, we saw a low voter turnout in the Liberal leadership elections that just ended. The same thing in the Ontario elections as well. We have generally across board in Canada low voter turnout. I think it's woeful and we need to do something about it. But what would your advice be on those 2 points?
Well, I mean, for an election campaign, it is it is incumbent upon voters to actually get informed and to be critically evaluate what you hear. I mean, there's obviously going to be people like me, pundits, who go on and spin it to art, how we think about things, right? And I sort of given my critical analysis of the Carney campaign, how I just don't have enough information actually to judge what they're going to do. And that's a big open, right? If it's a change election and he's saying he's changed, I want to know the direction of the change. In contrast, the Conservatives have given us a very clear direction of what they're doing, right? They have told us what the problem is and they've told us how they're going to solve it. The extent to which they can do that, again, is something that we don't know, but at least I know what's in the window in that campaign. And equally for the NDP, I know where they stand. I mean, they want to continue with increasing taxes to the wealthiest, increasing on spending in terms of pharmacare and dental care, and that's position, and I would understand that. I don't know what the Carney position is, and I do worry about him saying he's going to cut a carbon tax. He doesn't say that he's also cutting the rebate, which is interesting because that is part of the selling point for that carbon tax. So he's saying he's going to cut the carbon tax, cut the rebate, and replace it with something else, and we don't know what that is. So I think that that's something that people have to really question. Don't think about just what their credentials are or whether you like how they look or how they speak. That's just window dressing. Look at the policies. In terms of voter turnout, I don't get too concerned about it simply because it's our choice to do so. And when people don't turn out to vote, it seems to me that either they're not interested in politics, they're not educated about it, or they're not angry enough to vote. This election, I think, is going to show an increase in voter turnout because I think people are very angry. And I know that there's a high motivation to vote for Conservatives just because they really want change. And that's, again, where I think the polls aren't capturing the real thing happening on the ground. Yeah, sure, you phone somebody up and say, "Are you willing to vote Liberal?" And they go, "Yeah, I like the look of Carney." But does that mean they're actually going to go out on voting day and vote? Are they highly motivated to support them? What he's probably picking up on are Liberals who are not going to vote at all and that they might think about voting this time, but you've got to think about the contrast of those like 2,500 people who show up in London to a Poilievre event. All 2,500 of those are going to vote. And he's doing these rallies every single weekend and he's filling room. So, and the other thing to remember is that they have a lot of money to spend, do attack ads before the election. Once you get the election, they sort of limit. So I think that, Canadians, if you're motivated to vote, if you want change, then you have it in your power to do so. And we shouldn't be trying to overmanage people's voting choices either. And not voting is a choice. It is basically tacitly approving whatever happens. So even in the most recent Ontario election, we had the previous election was the lowest voter turnout ever. This one actually had an uptick about 1 or 2%. That's a little bit of good news, I guess, but it tells me that people didn't see their vote either mattering that much or that they didn't mind if it was going to be another progressive conservative victory in the province.
Right, thank you very much for that. I am actually very optimistic about the future of Canada. Are you?
Ask me after the election.
All right, I will do that then. But I'm very optimistic, and it's really great having the chat with you this time around.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you so
Nice
much.
talking to you.
Revaluate is a project I embarked upon to spark meaningful conversations that can inspire critical thinking as we navigate the adventures of life. The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time.